Hi, this is the manager's desk. My name's Evan Baltz. I'm a marketing technology leader and a team builder. And today we have a special guest. We talked to Jay last week about the basics of Agile. And I wanted to have Jay back, and it's probably going to be kind of a recurring thing because we have lots of things to talk about in terms of process and some of the more specific items with Agile that I think is a critical piece in being an effective manager. So, welcome, Jay.
Hello again, Evan. Good to be back.
And Jay, as we mentioned last time, is a CSPO, a CSM, a CSP-SM, a CAL, and was a PMP. So I'll send you to Google for looking up all those, or you can check the previous podcast where Jay explained all of those titles to us. But in essence, it means he knows what he's talking about when it comes to agile and process. And like I said, last time we talked about just kind of the how do you implement agile and how is it relevant to managers and employees and to executives? And this week I want to talk about one specific area of agile and a process, and we'll get into that. So, Jay, I'm familiar with and have used, I think, quite effectively in the past in Agile, the retro or the post-mortem. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is specifically?
For sure. Retro and postmortem are similar. Retrospective or retro is a very common agile term. And let's say we're at Scrum, which is the most common flavor of agile. We would have, say, a 2 week sprint. At the end of that sprint, we get the team together and maybe ask them something as simple as what went well, what didn't go so well, and then based on that, what should we do differently next time? What have we learned? So that really is similar to a post-mortem, which is more of a standard, business practice. We did that in the waterfall. We did the end of the project. So in agile, you might do it on a more frequent basis and call it a retrospective. And in a post-mortem, you might do it maybe at the end of an effort or end of a longer period of time. But they're roughly the same kind of ideas. The patient's dead. Why did they die? Or the patient, was a great success. How did we keep them alive?
What's the primary goal of the retro or the post-mortem?
I think it's just lessons learned so we can improve on that the next time. In a lot of instances, and I'm saying this rather tongue in cheek, it's the opportunity to play the blame game so that you can point the finger at someone else so that you don't get in trouble for whatever went wrong. That's the unfortunate behavior I've seen more than I would like to admit is that once you, and I think that's why we're going to contrast this with a different approach,
Yeah.
is once it's already done, there's not much we can do to fix it, but there is a tendency for people to want to escape, get away from taking blame and point fingers, and it's useless because we've already, the patient's already dead, so to speak.
And if that happens, Jay, um, what's the cause of that mentality in your mind? What creates that kind of an environment?
Yeah, I think that goes back to our conversation last time about culture. Typically, if you've got a culture where we really want to learn from our mistakes in the past just because we want to do a better job, I think people are going to be more open and honest about what went wrong, including something that they may have made a misjudgment or a guess that didn't work out the way they expected it to or whatever. So, and I think where you get into that blame game and the finger pointing tends to be more in an organization where okay, something went wrong, heads are going to roll type of approach.
So, and there needs to be top down needs to foster an environment where open communication happens on a regular basis, right? That's
Absolutely.
critical.
And you know what's funny is this really is a very tight parallel to what we talked about last week, which is the tools and things that we do can help us, but the culture needs to allow those things to be done a certain way. And we'll even what we're going to talk about today, the pre-mortem actually is a tool that can be used that will facilitate that type of culture. But if the culture is just clamped down and very hierarchical and not bought into any of this, it's like the analogy I used last time. If you go to the gym and you just eat donuts and pizza, you're certainly probably not going to reach your fitness goals.
Yeah, it's and I've thought of it in the past too. It's kind of like a democracy. If everybody who lives in the democracy is a criminal, guess how good the democracy is going to be? It's going to
Not
be
good.
terrible. It's going to be a
Correct.
horrible environment, right? It takes moral people with sound principles to make anything work. Agile is not a magic bullet. It doesn't necessarily solve culture problems. It sure can help if you are willing and allow it to help. But yeah, so you mentioned a pre-mortem. So what is exactly in your mind? What is a pre-mortem?
So the term that's used with the premortem, they call it prospective hindsight. In other words, hindsight is what you do in a postmortem. Hey, here's what went wrong. Prospective hindsight is trying to have that what is going to go wrong or what could go wrong and get a better grasp on risk that way.
So the ultimate goal of a pre-mortem is what?
Risk managing, let's say, identifying, assessing, and figuring out what we can do to manage risk. And that's the risk that we see up front. And it gives us that opportunity during these retrospectives, these recurring post-mortems that we hopefully don't just have at the very end of everything, but we have on a regular cycle, maybe like a 2-week sprint cycle, to help us understand what risks we saw coming and maybe didn't do enough about, and they showed up, versus what things went wrong that we were just completely blindsided by.
Yeah, and that sounds like a very high IQ type of meeting to have, right? Who attends it?
Yes, it is high IQ, but it's also some trickery, and I'm saying that sort of tongue in cheek. There's
Right.
if we do this process the right way, we're going to maximize that IQ, that even that EQ, if you will, if you're in an emotional intelligence, if you're familiar with that concept.
Yeah.
So yes.
So who do you want? Like if you have a
Oh, I beg your
team,
pardon.
just a regular team, yeah, who do you want
The
to
more
show up for
people,
this
the better.
meeting?
If you
Okay.
can get everybody involved, if you can get the people who are going to do the work, if you can get the stakeholders, if you can get all those people. Now, remember, you got to balance that with if we're in an organization that's very hierarchical and very top down, and we invite the boss who's standing over everyone, that may affect their psychological safety, either perceived or real, and that may affect what they do. Now, again, once we talk about the way we actually mechanically and tactically carry this out, we can minimize that. But there will be an element of that if the culture and if the people in that culture that may tend to suppress honesty are there or are
It,
there and that is felt as something that could
yeah,
affect
and
it.
that I've seen that too, right? Especially, and I've talked to team members about this in the past too. It's when you get I'd say most team members are pretty likely to talk to me about risks or in a retro to say specific things to
Mm-hmm,
me because there's maybe one level of separation, right?
mm-hmm,
I'm a director, I'm a manager, this is my direct report, they report directly to me.
mm-hmm,
In most cases I've seen, they're pretty likely to have a conversation with me about what could go
mm-hmm,
wrong, what's gone wrong, right? It's when you get to that second level and third level, say a VP or a senior executive, right? A
mm-hmm,
C-suite person,
mm-hmm.
that really has a chilling effect on what they say, right? And probably,
Yes.
and maybe that's okay in some fashion. So a solution maybe in some cases is have a meeting with the team members who are going to be doing the work and ask them about the risks. And then have a
Yes.
separate meeting with stakeholders and
Correct.
executives about the risks, and you take
Correct.
what you learned from the team members and share it and allow discussion at the higher level, so that there's not that barrier of, hey, I'm not going to speak up. I'm afraid. I mean, there's a C person in here and I'm a web developer. I don't really feel like I'm able to talk with that person freely. You could just throw your hands up, right, and say, well, our culture's not good enough, so this is going to fail. But finding some alternate solutions to that, does that make sense?
Yes, and here we go again. You like light this fire and open this can of worms. So I'm going to dive into the can a little
Yeah,
bit.
yeah,
Let's say the answer is always it depends, and a good coach or a good manager has some sense of the landscape and the culture.
right.
So let's say that you and I are helping coach and manage this organization that we're trying to do this exercise with. And our perception is, our feeling is, and we're aligned, you and I both feel there's a little bit of that fear culture, a little bit of that psychological safety might be missing. So here's what we can do. We could do that separate pre-mortem, one with the executive leadership, whatever you're going to call it, and one with the individual contributors who are actually doing the work. Have them be totally separate things, and then compare the results.
Right.
Because if we see a stark difference in those compared results, and then we could even do another pre-mortem with everybody in it and see what we get, right? Because that gives us factual data to back our aligned theory that there's a fear culture. And that's something we can then present to leadership and say, well, here's what our empirical results show. When we're all in a room together, the teams tend to clam up. When they're by themselves, and we don't have to individually point out any
Yeah,
individual
right.
person, the team overall is much more open. Hey, leadership, why do you think that is? And there's a valid point there. Just the fact that somebody has a job title higher up the ladder will intimidate some folks. But there's also an element of what are those folks doing? And you mentioned it, Evan, that with the people that work directly for you, because it's one level and because it's a one-on-one, I'd say there's another element that you're just being humble about, which is you're the type of manager who creates that psychological safety. So what we could say is to this manager, hey, look, we got two pre-mortems or three or however many we did. I wonder why the results are so different.
Yeah.
And then maybe if they're open to it, they might not be aware that there's that culture. They might be, if they're reasonable people, they might go, you got a point there. And they might even say in those results, hey, let's stick with these team only or individual contributor premortems until we can do something to get that perception or that culture change to where we can be there and they'll be open and honest. But there are a couple of things about the way we carry this out that can also help offset some of that stuff that we can talk about when we get into the specifics.
Yeah, I think those are great suggestions, Jay. It's one of those things where that culture piece always kind of taps everything in some way, right?
So
It's
true. It's
there.
the
And
foundation for sure.
yeah, and I've found as a manager, like it there are no perfect companies or organizations.
So true.
There's a lot of issues that have to be dealt with, and I think as a manager, you try to navigate that as much as possible, by finding, let's call it, creative solutions to
Mm-hmm.
those types of things, right? Which is part of the beauty of Agile, which is it's agile. It allows you to do that and modify certain things based on what you know to be true about your own organization, right? Where are the weaknesses? What are things that we have to put people in places and positions where we can, do the real work and get true answers from people. And you're right. I try to foster with anybody who works for me to say, look, when we're discussing work, when we're discussing a project, when we're talking about how we're going to do it and what we're going to do, what the solution is, what the technology is, that's a flat conversation, right? And I think as a manager, you need to establish that with your employees on a weekly basis, if not more frequently, which is, hey, when we're talking about projects and we're talking about this is a flat conversation. Your opinion is just as valid as mine. In fact, because you're doing the work, it's likely much more valid than my opinion. and making that clear to them that it's like it's important that you share what you think are the risks. And I can run that through my own processor to determine whether that's 100% valid or not and how it's going to relate to executive leadership, whatever. But saying that, hey, when we're meeting like this, either in a one-on-one or across the team, this is a flat conversation, right? I found that to be effective in terms of helping people to understand, look, there's no titles in this meeting. Everybody is just stating what they believe to be true, right?
Yes, and here we go again. The goal from a coach's perspective is to gain alignment. So if you and I are having a conversation, or you and somebody who reports to you or whatever are having a conversation, the goal would be to make an observation of the situation, see if we can figure what we're both seeing the same thing, and see if we both feel like the root cause or the base of whatever's going on is, if we can agree on what we think that is. And if you're right, and if it's this hierarchical thing of, well, this is what I say it is because I'm the boss, well, that's not going to work. So yes, if you can work with that goal comes alignment. And if we're not aligned, it might be because maybe one of us has a different perspective, might be because one of us have a different opinion. But in most cases, I found it's because we have different information or different framework of something. And if we can communicate that with each other, most reasonable people, given this a given set of data and evidence, will generally come up with a fairly consistent, we'll all kind of sort of agree, yeah, okay, you know, a lightning bolt landed over there and there's a tree on fire. Okay, I think the lightning bolt hit the tree. You know, most people will agree that that's probably what happened.
So how do you, in a pre-mortem, how do you prioritize risks, right? You may
Good.
have everybody throwing out, 100 risks for every single project. So how do
Yes,
you
yes.
prioritize those?
Do you mind if I take you through that? Because in order to answer
No,
that question
absolutely.
correctly,
No, let's
I
do it.
think the best thing to do is kind of explain how we go. It's only just a few steps. It's pretty
Yeah,
basic.
yeah.
So the first thing I would say is that the element of surprise is incredibly important. So what you've got to try to do is put this meeting together. And I don't want to be sneaky about it, but you can either just say we're going to have a meeting and or call it the pre-mortem. But the more people know about what we're going to do, the more, especially in that culture where they're scared, they might think ahead of time how they're going to answer and be more careful in their answers and less transparent and less honest. So the less they know going in, the better. When we start the meeting, we get everybody in the room. We say, okay, I want you to pretend that it's, say, a year from today. And we could do this at the beginning of a project, in the middle, anytime. At the beginning of an effort or the beginning of a team formation or the beginning of something new is a great time to do it. But we can do it anytime. Say, okay, I want to pretend it's a year from now. And this thing that we're doing, whatever this effort is that we're doing, this project, this team we're building, this effort, this product, whatever it is we're doing, it's a year from now and it has completely failed. Everything that could have possibly gone wrong has gone wrong. It's so bad that you're quietly updating your resume, talking to your friends. You're kind of not even talking to the other team members. There's all this discourse. I mean, it's just a disaster, absolute disaster. Okay, you've got 5 minutes. In that piece of paper sitting in front of you, write down everything that went wrong. Go. And then you put down that timer for 5 minutes. What that does, that element of surprise, gets people, everybody's thinking about this effort that we're doing and they have things they're concerned about it. And your goal by surprising them with this and by doing it this way is to get them to just blurt it out. What they've been dying to say, now they get a chance to write it down. And then what you can do is at the end of that 5 minutes, if people are still furiously writing at the end of 5 minutes of things that could go wrong, well, that should tell you something right there. Give them more time. Give them as much time as they need to where everybody, 80%, 90% of the room's like, okay, we're done. That's good. Usually 5 minutes is plenty. So now what you've got is you've got, let's say, 10 people in the meeting. You've got 10 lists of things that could go wrong. So your question was, how do you prioritize? How do you make sense of all that? Well, we start by just asking for a volunteer or going around the room and saying, hey, of all these things that you just wrote down, what is your biggest concern? Or you could ask them, what do you think is the most likely to go wrong? You can do either one. And so we'll go around the room a couple of times, and Evan, here's what's going to happen. Out of those 10 people in that room, 3 of them are going to have the same number one concern, probably. There's going to be repeats. So what we do is we say, okay, on the ink board or wherever,
Right,
if it's
right.
virtual, on a whiteboard or whatever, say, okay, this risk, you have said that risk. Now, the one you said sounded a lot like that first one. Is it the same? Yes. Okay. Now we put a tick mark. Now we go do other ones. We go around that first room, and now we've already got 3 tick marks next to one. Then we go around the room again, and now somebody's second most biggest concern was the one that has 3 tick marks next to it. It was their second biggest, but it's still pretty high. So that gets another tick mark. So we go around the room a few times, and what we'll start to see is a pattern. And in traditional business management or waterfall, we do this thing called a probability and impact assessment. So probability is the likelihood something could happen, right? And the impact is how big of a deal is it? So by going around the room enough times to where we feel like we've gotten a good sampling, and we can even ask people, hey, is there anything that you have that you think is important that's not on this list? And then, we can kind of just, get everybody's brain dump out that way. Say, okay, whatever has the most tick marks is the highest probability. Then what we can do is go back, if we haven't done this already, and ask, okay, y'all, regardless of the chance of this happening, even if it's, a meteor falling out from the sky and killing the whole
Right.
universe, which one of these things, regardless of probability, would just wipe us out if it happened, would be really huge. And then we can put little X's next to that, or, some other mark or something. And that gives us our impact. So anything that's got a lot of tick marks next to it is high probability. And if it's also got a lot of whatever that impact mark is, that's high impact and probability. We could put that on a grid if we want, imagine impact and probability. If it's
Right
on
in a
the
quadrant.
highest level, we bet that's something we want to, we want to focus on that. If somebody jokingly once in a pre-mortem said Elvis is still alive, okay, that's pretty low
He's
probability.
not?
And
I don't, isn't that a
exactly.
widely held belief?
Yeah, I don't know, conspiracy, tinfoil hats or whatever. So the impact is very low, but the probability is also very low. So we're not going to spend a lot of time worrying about if Elvis is alive, but
Right.
something that's higher up the probability and or higher up the impact scale. Those are the things we really want to focus on. So what we can do is go around the room, kind of get that sense, discuss it a little bit. And what that does, first of all, it gives people permission to be honest because we're kind of putting them on the spot, right? And then it also gives people permission to be negative. And it also prevents something called go fever. And I don't know, do you want me to explain what I mean by people, your
Yeah, and
listeners?
I was gonna mention something here too, Jay. Like I have heard a complaint in the past, and usually it's from higher level leaders. It's like, well, I don't like that we do this or retro because it makes everybody negative. It just
Yeah,
turns into a
yeah,
complaint session.
yeah.
And how do you combat that mentality?
Very good. So one thing is that we're talking about it up front. So we're talking about preventative. So we're not in this post-mortem where things have gone wrong and everybody's pointing fingers and blaming and being negative. We're saying, no, we are thinking about what might go wrong so that we can do something about it or be prepared for it. We can mitigate it or realize, hey, there's nothing we can do about whether Elvis is alive or not. So who cares? Don't worry about it. But we've identified that's, something that could happen. But here's another approach, a twist on the pre-mortem I've seen people do. And certain clients that I've worked with that are just incredibly optimistic in their culture and don't like negativity at all. And I won't mention any names, but one of them makes a lot of very famous movies for children. So you can probably guess who that is. But because they had that culture of that's too much negativity, we can break the room in half and say, okay, this, or, 1, 2, 1, 2, whatever, if your last name starts with, whatever or whatever. Okay. So this half of the room, y'all over here, you do the opposite. I want you to write a newspaper headline that in 1 year from now, everything went perfect and tell me all the things that went right. And hey, all of you over here on this side of the room, let's do the traditional pre-mortem. Tell us everything that went wrong. Now, if the culture is that we're afraid of negativity, that's another twist on the pre-mortem we could do that would then have the positive and the negative side. We still get the benefits. Just only half as many people would be participating in the negative side.
what would you say are, in your experience, what are the most common risks that are identified?
Oh, that's a good one. It depends, right? That's my standard coach answer. But I would say it depends on the culture of the organization. But what I've seen over and over again is halfway through this initiative, we're going to change our mind.
Ah, yes.
That's
Changing
one.
priorities.
Second one is, and this is related, is we're not going to be focused enough on this one thing. We're going to be doing 16 things at a time, changing gears back and
Right.
forth.
It's this project isn't going to be done in a vacuum, so that creates all sorts of unknowns, right?
Right. And then along with that is the things like we're not going to be supported the way we need to. We're not going to have the resources we need. We're not going to have it's that type of stuff. So that I would say, and those all kind of, you could kind of put those into a basket. That is the thing that I typically hear the most is we're all excited about this right now, but we're not going to get the support and the backing and the consistency that we need to really see this through. The other one I hear a lot, it depends on the customer, is we're not going to get this regular customer and stakeholder feedback. They're going to wait, we're going to ask them every 2 weeks or however often, please come and tell us what you want. Give us your feedback. Look at this thing. And they'll be like, I don't have time for that. And then 6 months down the road, when they finally come and look, they're going to be like, that's not what I wanted at all. And be like, well,
How do you define those roles then to say that's a requirement, right? You have to provide some sort of input along the way so that the teams can adjust effectively. Because
there
here's
you go.
here's here's one I've heard,
Well,
Jay.
you asked the good questions.
Yeah, here's one I've heard in the past is like, well, I can't give you any feedback on the content for that web page until I see it actually on the page. So go
Mm-hmm,
ahead and develop the page and do all the
mm-hmm,
programming and everything, and
mm-hmm.
then I'll give you my advice on the wording because I have to
Right,
see it in context,
right.
right?
So, okay, that's another whole can of worms. Evan, you're
Yeah,
on a
it
roll.
is.
Okay, so number one, and I don't have any graphics, so I'm just gonna have to you have to use your imagination with me. Imagine there's a circle, like a pie with three pieces of pie or three pieces of pizza. I feel like pizza better than pie. One piece of that pizza is the team that does the work. One piece of the pizza is the scrum master or the coach, the person who's kind of trying to help us with this process. And the other piece is the product owner. They're the one who sets the priorities of what work needs to get done. And they represent the outer layer of what they do is representing the customers and the stakeholders. So when the customers and the stakeholders ask for something, it's the product owner's job to work with the stakeholders and the team to figure out how in a, say, a 2 week window, we can produce something that they will look at or that there is some value to look at. And it can be something as easy as a sketch of something. It doesn't have to be, we have to think in this way of what is deliverable in a short window. And that's a hard change to make, even for people who really want to do it. It's because we're so used to saying, I want to see this wrapped in a bow, pretty thing. We have to get better at that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, Evan, and you're not going to like this answer maybe, but the agile answer to non participative stakeholders and customers that won't show up is to just stop working. Because what they're doing, here's a concept for you. I call it the $80,000 um, an hour product owner. So let's say that this product owner, stakeholder, customer, this whole representative of the people who are asking for the work, can't come once every 2 weeks for an hour to see what we've been doing for the last 2 weeks. Let's say we have 10 people on our team. Let's say that each person costs the company $100 an hour. Just you could, you can do that
Right,
math,
right.
right? Their salary plus the overhead plus the office space or whatever. Let's say we have 10 people. We have a product owner, scrum master, it's 7 or 8 people, whatever, 10 people, number's easy. And let's say they cost us $100 an hour and it's 80 hours in a 2 hour window or 2 week window. That's, if I'm doing the right math, right, that's $80,000. So these people are going to work for 2 weeks with no guidance from the people who are supposed to be telling us what we need to be doing. So what they're saying is their time is so valuable, it's worth more than $80,000 an hour because they won't come once every 2 weeks and show up for an hour to give feedback. Now, that's not going to go that well in when you deliver that message, you need to deliver it in the right way to the right people. But we've got to show them that you not being able to show up and give us that feedback means we're just wandering out in the desert for 2 weeks, guessing what the right thing is to do.
Yeah, and I've what I've seen in the past too is like I think a good way to handle it is within Agile, whether you're using Jira or some other project management system or whatnot, is to officially declare things blocked until that person
Mhm.
does their job, right?
Absolutely.
To say, well, we're ready to continue, but we're going to have to report to executives that we're blocked because you haven't completed your review at
There
this
you go.
particular time. There's a little bit of a it's a little bit of a negative motivator, but it's necessary, right? It's like we agreed that this was part of the process. It's you need to evaluate it. And I think what happens is they don't want to do that because they want to withhold judgment until later and want to have complete flexibility to change their mind at any given point. And when you've done a certain amount of work and they've approved it and given feedback, no, this is good, let's move forward, you're essentially locking in that piece of it. And there are leaders who don't want to have things like that happen. They want to reserve the right to change their mind at any given minute. And what I've tried to express to those people in the past is you can't do that. And the reason you can't do that is because what you just said, it's going to cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars for you to constantly change your mind. We have to move forward. We have to have accepted sort of practices here. We want to get you what you want, but we're creating a system which is going to make you think those things through ahead of time and respond to them in a reasonable fashion, not at the 11th hour kind of thing.
Yes, Evan. Yes, and once again, if we're doing that on a regular increment, let's say every 2 weeks, let's say that that product owner, that stakeholder customer shows up and goes, no, that's totally wrong, or the market's changed, or now that I've seen it, I really wish it was this. Even if we do scrap those 2 weeks and lose them and have to redo some work or change something, it's just the 2 week window.
It's better
So,
than a 1 year project that you scrap and
bingo.
start over, right?
I would argue that getting that regular feedback allows the product owner to be a little more uh, flexible and mind changing because the time window is so narrow. I'll tell you what else happens too, which, and now we're getting way off of the pre-mortem topic, but who cares? If they come to us after the 2 weeks and we say, hey, here's what we built, they might go, oh my gosh, that's not really what I was thinking, but it's actually better. Or, hey, I like that. Why is this way? Well, in order to do this way, you said it had to be this way. And in order to do it that way, that's a ton of work. Is there another way you could do it? Well, if we did it this way, we could do it in 5 minutes. Wait, you're saying that you could do it this way in 5 minutes
Yeah.
or this way in 6 months? I don't care. Do the 5 minute version. And now we just saved 6 months minus 5 minutes of extra work.
And just on
So,
that point, to sell it as a positive thing, right? This is
mhm,
the thing. You allow people to offer you alternate suggestions that you may not be aware of. Because what I've discovered, especially in the technical world, but it happens in creative and
it
in
does.
most areas as well, but especially in the technical world, somebody, and I remember this at a large retailer that we both worked at.
I'm
And
familiar with that company. Yes.
yeah, and the question, and one of the questions was, right, like, well, we want to do it this way. And we went back to the IT folks and they said, wow, they really have to have it that way. That's like an extra 500 hours worth of labor to get that thing that they want. And I was kind of a middleman there. So I said, well, what would be a better way to get close to what they want? Well, we could do X, Y, and Z, and that would only take us about 20 hours as opposed to like 1,000 hours, right? Because it's just a simpler way to do it. And we think it gets them 85, 90% of the way. Said, great, I'll take that back to them. Here you go. You can have what you want. They're like, great, it'll be 1,000 hours. And they thought it would be in your best interest to give you an alternative option, which would be far less time consuming and far less much of an expenditure of resources. And it's this, and it's not going to get you 100%. It's going to get you 85 or 90% of you want. Which uh, option would you like us to follow? And what that does is it gives them, they're still the decision maker, right? I have given them two options, or they have created one option. I have created a second option, but I'm still allowing them to be the decision maker, right? To commit to one or the others. And in most cases, they'll take the advice and go the less complicated route. And they're like, oh, I didn't know that that was an option. That's what I hear most frequently. But it's amazing to me in how many organizations there are people too, especially at the manager level, they're almost too afraid to offer an alternate solution. And I think in doing a pre-mortem, it gives you the opportunity to see what these major issues or complications or risks might be and come up with alternative
Yes.
solutions. So my question is then, Jay, it's like, so we've identified, let's say we've identified a good number of risks and we've had a
Mhm.
great session and we had a good pre-mortem. Now, throughout the project, how are those risks mitigated and whose responsibility is it to mitigate them?
So if we do it right and allow enough time, we don't just end the premortem with this probability and impact list. We have another session that says, okay, what are these higher probability impact items and what can we do to mitigate them? And some of them, we may just say there's nothing we can do to mitigate that. I worked for a client in the past that their entire industry was based on a set of legal allowances that allowed them to charge very high interest rates to certain very high risk individuals. And the current president of the United States at that time had threatened to outlaw that practice. So that company knew that if this law all of a sudden changed, their entire business model might be out the window. So, what can we do about that as a development team? Nothing. So, what we would do is say that is a high risk, high probability problem. And if it comes, we're just going to have to totally rescramble. There's not
Right.
much we can do about that. But most things, there is something we can do to mitigate. And here's what's really neat too is by identifying these things up front, and I alluded to this before, every retro we have, or every other retro, or whenever, we can say what went right, what went wrong. And of the things that went wrong, can we refer those back to that premortem? Because if something went wrong and it's not on the premortem, then we got blindsided. We didn't know it was coming. And that happens. That's life. And then we would treat that differently than something that we identified as high impact, high probability that we could do something about versus something that was high impact, high probability that we determined there's really not much we can do. So at least it gives us that comparative capability and will show us examples of we knew this was coming. We said we were going to do something and we didn't because it still happened. Or whatever our mitigation approach was, it wasn't effective. Does that answer your
Yeah.
question?
Yeah. And it's interesting because there will be items that on your list of risks that won't rear their head at all. And you might make the assumption then, well, we don't have to think about that next time. And that's a mistake, right? It's important to every case, it may happen. And then there's going to be items, and everybody has to accept it. There are going to be, and I always tell everybody, there's going to be two or three things, and this happened at the large retailer 750 requirements for things. There's going to be two or three things that we can't foresee that are going to go wrong. And how are we going to address those unforeseen things? And I told people the story. I have a friend who worked for, I believe it was Circle K, and she was a risk management person. This was her sole job, was to identify risks for the organization, right? For their stores, essentially. And one, uh, you know, trying to sleep at night knowing that there's probably a million other things that could go wrong that you haven't identified, but they would put a percentage probability, right? Just like you were saying, Jay. Um, and then she said she came into the office one day and someone was using their restroom, fell over, broke the toilet seat, and is suing us for injuries received while using our facilities. And she's like, nope, didn't have that one on my bingo card, right? Like that was not something that anyone had ever foreseen would be an issue. But getting to the place within an organization, we talked about it previously too. There will be bugs. There will be things that go wrong, and giving people an opportunity to not panic when that happens by saying, look, this particular item is unexpected, but how we respond to it, we have a plan. We have a process for dealing with things that are unexpected, right? And just setting that as a mentality for the organization, I think, is critical as well.
Yes, and once again, Evan, you keep like it's like you're putting everything on a big T for me.
Yeah.
Like
Oh, I like to tee it up for you.
I appreciate that. So here's let me read you something. Just I'm just going to read you
Yeah, yeah.
something. Okay, just bear with me. Research conducted in 1989 by Deborah J. Mitchell. I want to give these people credit of the Wharton School, Jay Russo of Cornell, and Nancy Pennington of the University of Colorado found that prospective hindsight, the premortem, imagining that an event has already occurred, increases the ability to correctly identify reasons for future outcomes by 30%. We have used
There you
perspective
go.
to devise a method called a premortem, which helps. So you and I we were just talking about the toilet situation. So we aren't going to imagine everything, but by using this more collaborative, putting people kind of on the spot in a room approach, we're going to get 30% better results and 30% more of what goes wrong we knew is going to go wrong or we predicted could go wrong. And so we're more well prepared to handle that. So I'll take that. And because what you talked about as well is what typically gets done is there's a risk management person or a risk management team, and they have to just sit there and dream out of their heads what the risks are or look at history or that type of thing. But if you get the people who are actually doing the work to all get together collaboratively and make a list, it's the wisdom of the crowd, if you will. And there's a whole, that could be a whole nother podcast, but you're getting that opinion of all the people that are boots to the ground, and you're going to get a 30% better outcome.
And I think one of the things that's helpful about that too is for team members, for managers, especially at the end of a project, then if there were things that weren't identified, right, as an issue, and then it creeped up, there's less blame game. I think it gives you an opportunity to say,
Exactly.
we gave everybody the opportunity to articulate what they thought the risks would be. This one was not on anyone's radar. So
Correct.
you can't sit back as a CEO or something and say, why didn't you guys think of that? It's like, well, you were there. You didn't think of it, right?
Yep.
It's not, we are not going to be perfect in our risk evaluation. No one ever is, right? There's always going to be things that we can't identify. But what we did is we gave everybody an opportunity to put their brains together and come up with all of the possibilities that we could think of and have a proper way to sort of handle that. What we will learn in the future for future ones is that there were some additional ones this time around that we didn't think of. There will be new ones in the next project, but we'll make note of the ones that we failed to identify last time. And what I like to do, Jay, is I like to categorize those, right? Because the specifics are usually relative to a particular project and that changes over time, right? But what doesn't change is categories of things that go wrong, right? Work didn't wasn't completed on time, therefore we fell behind. The organization had, financial issues halfway through, whatever it might be. There are categories for that, and then we can have specific mitigation techniques based on a category, right? And in some cases, you throw your hands up and say there was nothing we could do about that. That was unforeseen, and we just had to handle it as best we could, right? What
Absolutely.
are what are some of the obstacles that you see in a pre-mortem or in risk assessment? What are some of the obstacles into that being effective?
Biggest challenge I've had in the, oh geez, 14
Right. I should have
or
used
so
the word
years.
opportunity because that's what they tell everybody to say.
Yeah,
Don't
that's right.
say problems. Don't even say
Right.
challenges or obstacles. Say
Opportunity.
what are the
Yeah.
opportunities that one might have when attempting to do risk
Yes.
assessment?
The biggest challenge for me with the premortem is getting it to happen. People don't know something or they're not used to doing something. And when you say, hey, we need to get everybody in the room together for an hour, maybe 2 hours if we can. If we want to do that mitigation, it may take 2 hours. Can we get everybody in the room together for an hour or two? Why? Well, there's this exercise that's really powerful. Why? Well, it's called the premortem. What does it do? It looks in risk and it's very effective. Oh, we already have a risk assessment team. Okay. I've never had a premortem happen where down the road people weren't very aware of the value. And because here's what happens, Evan, you said categorization. Yes, that's a wonderful thing to do. Here's some other wonderful things. You also mentioned at the end you're less likely to point blame. Well, what is the most important thing we keep talking about is the culture. So if we know we're going to
Yeah.
get to the end of an effort and there's not going to be all the blame gaming, what are people going to do the next time? They're going to be more likely to speak up. They're going to be more likely. And if our leadership, executives, bosses, customers are fair and reasonable human beings, and they say, well, we did this really thorough risk assessment up front called the premortem, and we didn't see it. We didn't see COVID coming. We didn't
Yeah.
see
Right. That's a big one.
9/11 coming, right?
Yeah.
Those are what in the Johari window, that's a whole nother conversation, are the unknown unknowns, right? There's just no way we could have predicted those
Right.
things. So the more we can say, look, here's all the things we predicted. This thing that happened, did you predict it? And if they're honest, they'll say, no, we didn't see that coming. Okay, so fair. Now it's a lot less of blame and it's a more of a realistic calculation of why we ended up where we ended up, either ahead of the goal or better than we thought or worse than we thought or a mix of two depending on what area.
Well, and I think it goes back to just agile in general. For instance, I've had teams where we started to, work on stories and write stories, and people say, well, I don't understand it, or I'm not good at that, right? Well, how is it with anything else in your life? How do you become good at something? Right? One, you watch other people do it and you learn from them. And two, you practice it, right? And what I think is interesting is, let's say just a web developer on my team. They may not have any experience doing a risk assessment, right? They may have never done that before. They aren't familiar with how to identify risks or whatnot, at least in the formal sense, right? The way you get good at it is by someone asking you the question, what could possibly go wrong? And say it, and then have them think about, like you said, have them think about, well, what's the probability of that happening? The more times that your teams do these exercises, the better they get at them, whether it's a
Mhm.
retro, whether it's a pre-mortem, whether it's just a daily stand up or whatever it is, you get better by doing it, by practicing, right?
Yes, and once again, there you go, opening up another can of worms, Evan. There's something that I call the emperor's new clothes syndrome. And if you're familiar with that fable from the old days, is that
Yep.
the emperor gets this cloak, and the little kid innocently asks an honest question, and everybody's shocked, and they realize, yeah, he's right. So what I've always done as a coach is when we get a brand new team member, we have them participate in all the ceremonies, the retrospective, and the demo right from the beginning, because they have this outside perspective. They have different experience, different whatever, and they might say something that might be the most powerful question that goes after an assumption we've had forever that might be a bad assumption or might not be the optimal assumption. So I've seen in premortem the new person come in and make something that just rocks everybody's world. So to me, absolutely, for sure.
Yeah, and that's why having teams who are, I like to think of it as just different walks of life. And I mean that by,
Yes.
their professional
Mhm.
pathway to get where
Mhm.
they've been,
Mhm.
their sort of station in life, their age, all of that plays into and makes them excellent together as a group.
Mhm.
Because somebody who's done it for 40 years has lots of knowledge about what can go wrong, right?
Mhm.
more knowledge than somebody who just starting. But the person who
Mhm.
just is starting doesn't have preconceived notions about how things
Mhm.
are. They're coming at it with a fresh perspective and may say, "Why do you do it like that?" Well, we've always done it that way. Well, that's probably the problem, right? You've never thought that there's a better way to do it. So I think having those discussions makes everybody better at all of it, right?
Yes, and if you get a large enough group together, in my experience, it's usually about 9 people or so, because you have this, and I'm going to call it diversity of experience, diversity of background, not just diversity as we talk about it a lot about, like,
Right, right.
your racial background, but real true, just from a different place or a different language or a different way of, different company, different, just a hodgepodge of different backgrounds. Generally speaking, you're going to get out of a group of 9 or so people that one person that always just calls it like they see it, right? The kind of brave person, or
Yep.
person who innocently just asks the question. And sometimes those outlier people are the ones that save us tons and tons of time, or help us address that, emperor's new clothes issue that has been kind of just assumed away, or ignored, or scared of, or whatever. So absolutely, yes.
How do you know then ultimately, like this is a question I ask about everything. Um, you've identified risks and you've reviewed them throughout, but how do you know that that assessment uh, was truly valuable, and how do you evaluate whether it was successful or not?
Yeah, that's actually really pretty straightforward. So you create that premortem, right? And you've got the high impact, high probability items, and as many of those as you can, you come up with some type of mitigation plan, or the realization there is no mitigation plan. And then as the project goes, and by the end of the project, when we do our post-mortem, we can compare what we predicted and said we could mitigate versus what actually happened. And I think that is simply right there. And you can just count. Hey, here's all the things we thought could go wrong. Here's the things we did to mitigate. And here's what the outcome was. This never happened. This never happened. This never happened. This one did. But because we had a mitigation plan in effect, we believe that the impact of that was much lower, or we were more prepared for it, or whatever. I think that's pretty easy to do in a postmortem. And you can again do that at each retro if you want, or every other retro, or whatever, in some kind of a cyclical basis, every 2 weeks or so, and get that sense as you go. And like you said, whatever we learn here, we'll do a pre-mortem the next time we start a new initiative, or a new product, or a new team, or a new department. And whatever we've learned from the last time we did a pre-mortem, that'll help us be better at pre-mortems the next time.
Yeah, and ultimately, I think that is the goal, right? Lessons learned, and how do we improve next time? Maybe we need to look deeper at risks, or maybe we need to have a better plan for things that go wrong, whatnot. It helps the entire process improve, right? Over time, you benefit from those lessons learned.
Yes, and another conclusion could be we're so risk averse that we spend all this time mitigating things. We mitigated 15 things and none of them happened. Maybe that's another piece of
Right.
knowledge for us. It's like, yeah, we're worried about everything, and we spend so much time, trying to prevent something that's almost never happens. Maybe our risk tolerance is, it depends on what industry you're in. If you're working for Boeing making 747s, okay, let's be have a very low risk tolerance. But if you're, something else, and doing some less risky, less life endangering thing, maybe we don't need to worry about it so much.
And if you're a manager, a director, a VP out there, you're going to be, it's going to be important for you to understand that risk aversion by the organization that you're in, because like you mentioned, they're all different. And sometimes you will be surprised at how cautious an organization is. Or on the other hand, how like, that probably won't happen. Let's just move forward, right? Like, let's not worry about it. I worked for a startup, and there was no risk assessment. It was like, whatever we do, we're going to just do it as quickly as we can. And if it fails, it fails, and we'll do something else, right? And then a large organization, with thousands of employees and, a brand that you'd recognize and stuff, they can be very risk averse, right? They want to make sure that there's as little as risk as possible about anything that they do. And it can be very taxing. And in fact, it's interesting that had an experience where a CEO of a moderately sized company of about 200 came to work for a large retailer. In other words, the retailer bought them out. So they came on as an executive at the large retailer, and he gave his initial speech to the marketing team. And after the speech, I turned to my coworkers and I said, he'll be gone in 9 months. Now, they just looked at me like, what are you talking about? And I said, there's a guy who has no patience for bureaucracy. And we all know that this gigantic organization is full of bureaucracy. And the things that he says he wants to accomplish in 9 months will take 2 years. He'll get frustrated and he'll leave. Now, Jay, I am not a prophet. However, after 9 months, he left almost to the day of when I said that he would leave. And it was for that exact reason. There's a different threshold for risk, for assessing risks, and for how fast you move forward. And if you don't understand the organization that you're a part of and where they are on the scale, you will get frustrated, whether it's they're too experimental or they're not experimental enough, right? You can get frustrated. So I would encourage managers and directors to have that discussion. And especially if you're in a job interview, ask the organization to assess their own risk aversion, right? Say, how progressive are you when it comes to projects? How willing are you to fail? Those are some important questions that can help you then understand where the organization sits and how valuable a pre-mortem would be in that environment, right? And how honest people are going to be and how successful you can be. Take all of those pieces in and kind of, get the sense and ask the individual contributors too, do you think that, we're being too optimistic about this, in your opinion, right? And listen to what they have to say because they know from experience. Is there anything else, Jay, specifically related to risk assessment that you think is worth noting to our viewers?
We're pretty good coverage on it there. I do want to just tack on something to the last statement you just made.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think the size of the company is a factor. We also talked about the industry too. So there's a
Yeah.
very large retail company that I worked for. It's actually where I learned Agile originally. We'll keep their name out of it. And they're one of the biggest companies in the world. But their thing that they kept reminding their employees almost all the time, almost like once a week, you would hear some executive say, hey, remember, it's just tennis shoes and t shirts. So quit freaking out. Because people would get so obsessed with, this risk
Yeah.
management and all this stuff. Your industry makes a big difference too. Again, if you're, making airplanes or you're making spaceships or you're making, medical devices, okay, that's a different risk tolerance. But sometimes I agree that you size as something, industry as something. There's all these different aspects, and I think premortems and good risk management, especially when we can do this. Here's what we saw coming, and here's what actually happened, can help us help that leadership realize, is our risk tolerance level in line with what it should be based on all those things, company size, industry, all that type of stuff.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Jay, because something I have told team members, and most of the work that I've done has been in marketing, web development, web design, technical infrastructure, things like that. And one of the things I always tell them, try things, nobody's going to die, right? Like this isn't that kind of an industry, right? Especially if it's web development, right? It's not even print, right? If you make a mistake in print, it's forever, right? It's like you don't recall the magazine, right? It's out there forever. And your mistake can be viewed by people 100 years from now. The website, if something goes wrong, you fix it and it's done and it's gone, right? And so no one dies. And keeping that perspective so people aren't too overly concerned about making mistakes because that can cripple creativity, it can cripple alternative ideas. I'm afraid to make a mistake. It's like if you make a mistake, look, we're not in an industry where people die. We're making a website, right? And things will go on and things will break and things will happen and it'll be forgotten and we'll be fine. So, we want to do the best. We want to have quality. And I think one final thing to stress for everybody too is there's a difference between perfection and excellence, right? The pursuit of perfection will cause you to be dismayed 100% of the time because you can't be perfect, right? But excellence is something to achieve. And by evaluating the risks, understanding them and having a plan to mitigate them and have everybody on the same page is striving for excellence. It's not a goal to be perfect, it's a goal to be excellent. And the more you do it, the more you practice, the more you train your people and encourage them and help them, the more excellent you will get. Hey, we would love for you to leave your comments for us. We're always open to questions. Jay and I love questions. If you have a question about anything that we discussed on today's show or the previous show, please mention it in the comments. We'd be happy to address it in a further podcast, or we'll do it in writing right there. But there's comment sections. We'd love to hear from you. And also remember, you can follow the manager's desk on Spotify, YouTube, iHeartRadio, Instagram, X, and Amazon Music. How does that? That's pretty awesome, right, Jay? Like, how many different social media platforms can the manager's desk even be on? Pretty awesome.
Very good.
Uh, and so for Jay and myself, we thank you again. Thanks, Jay. Appreciated having you on again, and we'll see you again sometime. And for my producer, Michael Scott, that's a joke. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Evan. It was a pleasure as always.
All right. Thanks, Jay.